podcasts are manageable. They really are. But the question is, once all of your friends on social media have followed you, what else are you bringing to the table? Podcasting can really be a challenge for most people. There's a lot of things involved, but at the same time, it seems so simple. So you might be asking, should I start one? How do I improve? Do I actually need to make it good? You know, there's a lot of questions that come into play when you're trying to deal with podcasts specifically. So I want to take some time right now and go through a little bit of my experience regarding making a quality podcast. Now, you clicked on this video, so I'm assuming that's something you're interested in. I'm not going to tell a whole lot about myself, except that I've done well over 200, been a part of well over 200 podcasts. I've hosted and been behind the technicals of over 180 podcasts, and so I've felt it out. I've made low quality stuff, I've made high quality stuff, and so I just want to teach a little bit of my knowledge, and hopefully it's helpful. I want to start a little bit where most people's mind goes first, and that is actually equipment. So when you get started, you're like, okay, I got to record. I want to do a podcast. Where do I actually start? And a lot of people's mind goes to equipment right away, because ultimately, in order for a podcast to work, you need to record it. So the first thing people think of is like mics or one mic if it's going to be a one-person podcast. You also have mic stands. Another thing is an audio recorder. So these are all things that's necessary for recording a podcast at its very core. It's just the audio. And then there's also the aspect of video. I need cameras, tripods, lights. I've made a list of these things. So if you go through, you could screenshot them, or you could, just take notes. These are actually things that really is all that's required, but I know it's pretty common. It's pretty basic, but these are the things that you kind of need to get started to make a quality podcast. I know right now there's a fad of, just everybody start a podcast, everybody just get out their phone and record. But when it comes down to how do I make my podcast stand out, a big factor of that is going to be the quality of the podcast. So is it filmed well? Can you tell it's on something that's a little bit better than, say, a phone or a computer, camera, a webcam? Is the audio quality something that's really good? So let's start with audio. As I already mentioned, you have mics, you got mic stands, and you have an audio recorder. Just to break that down, you can choose a whole variety of microphones, honestly. I actually have one here that is different than this one. I'll start with this one, actually. This one is a Shure mic. These are kind of one of the standards when it comes to podcasts these days. However, getting started to make something quality, you don't necessarily need to buy one of these. These look really cool on camera. We're going to be honest. That's why a lot of people get them. Not only that, they sound amazing, even for music recording. However, sometimes you might not be able to just spend $350, $400 on a microphone like this. Sometimes you only have say $25 or $30. Well, there's actually the same company, a Shure. Shure Microphones has this option, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to just this. So this is the quality we're getting from this dynamic Shure microphone. Granted, it doesn't look as cool on camera, but sometimes the audio quality is different, but most of the time people don't really know or can hear the difference super well. A big reason for that is because it's XLR. So It's a 3-pin balanced audio signal. And so if you don't have it in the budget to get something really fancy, you can literally just go with one of these. Back to why a microphone stand is important is because you don't really want to be touching the microphone constantly. A lot of podcasts have the arm, and that's a great option, but a lot of times those arms are built to withstand sound. You don't want to hold a microphone during a podcast, especially if you're doing it for a long time. But also, if you start messing around, you start hearing sounds like this. So a stand's important. Stand is very important to hold the microphone in place so that you get the best possible quality out of a microphone. And then obviously the audio recording. There's a whole bunch of ways you can do audio recording for a podcast, and there's so many people that do it differently. If you are on a budget, really all you need is just an audio recorder, something made by Tascam or a company like that has a XLR input into it. So it can go straight from the microphone to the audio recorder, and it records on an SD card. That's one of the cheapest yet most effective and quality options that is out there. So if you want to get quality audio, you got to use a good mic. It doesn't have to be super expensive, but you should use a good mic. You shouldn't just pull out a phone, lay it down, and just expect people to listen for 30 minutes to an hour to 2 hours, because a lot of times you got to take into consideration the viewers and the listeners. You have to consider their comfort while listening to you or someone you're talking to speak. And so it's important that you go the extra mile to get quality out of your audio. That's number one. Podcasts are audio. Speaking of the viewer, you got cameras. So cameras, tripod, lights. There's also a lot of way to film a podcast, but a couple of the main things is that you have cameras, and a lot of podcasts do just record with video on their phone or from their webcam or from a very old cheap camera with one angle. That can be engaging, but you have to do a lot of work as a podcast host to get that attention. So what I recommend is if you have the ability to have a couple cameras, sometimes you got to spend some money to get really quality stuff, but once you do, you have it. So Sony has these awesome camcorder cameras that are like between $600 and $800 a piece. Blackmagic, if you want to go a little bit more expensive, has full-on cinema-style cameras or just production cameras for about $1,000 a piece. You could go really cheap and do a few $100s, but a lot of times people can notice. But that's not a make or break thing. Really the make or break thing is the lights, because the camera always reacts to the light. To get something good looking in camera, you have to have good exposure. You have to set up your lights correctly. I'm not going to go through all the techniques of setting up a light for a podcast, but sometimes just a softbox, fluorescent light that can be shining on one side of the face is all you need, because it lights up a lot. That's what I'm using right now. And then the other thing you need, because a lot of times you can't afford the equipment when you're getting started to have this big system where you're capturing live the conversation and the camera switching and the audio. You don't have all of the equipment to connect it into one file there live. So a lot of times you have to edit your podcast. You got to put, compressors on the audio. You got to just adjust the audio level. You have to edit your video to switch between cameras. And I actually use a software called Adobe Premiere Pro. There are other options out there, but Adobe Premiere Pro is a great option. There's something called the Adobe Suite if you're not familiar with it. But if you just want Adobe Premiere Pro, especially for podcasts, this works very well where you don't have to have any other applications, because this does great audio editing and mixing. This does great, it's built for video, it's built for editing film. And so I wanted to show you real quick, there's also features inside of Adobe Premiere that allows you to actually switch in playback like you are actually there in the studio doing live switching. So like, for example, I have 3 cameras set up here. This is actually the podcast that me and my brother and my good friend Wyatt do, if you're not a fan of the show already. And what we do is we actually have 3 cameras. So we have a close-up on me and Wyatt, we have one on my brother, and then we have a wide shot of all 3 of us. You can actually switch between the cameras live. So you can go to the middle one, and then the close-up. On Joshua,
no loafers.
on the wide,
They're very multifunctional.
on the close-up,
It's gotta be like Vans or sneakers or something. We're not allowed to be calling girls.
so you can pretty much just play through it, and you can actually do live switching. So you don't have to do all this drag and moving around constantly. You just set up your timeline like you're going to play through it straight, and you can actually use your keyboard 1, 2, and 3 to switch between your 3 cameras. It's a really cool function. And there are YouTube videos out there that explain how to set up and create a multi-camera sequence. That's the terminology that Adobe Premiere uses. But let's get back to creating a quality podcast. Another thing you have to think about when getting started is hosting sites. This is actually extremely important because how are you distributing your podcast? Well, obviously, if you're doing a video, there's the one, YouTube. And a lot of times people start there. They're just like, I want to start a podcast on YouTube if you're thinking about video. If you're thinking about audio, maybe you're like, I want to get it on Apple Podcast or I want to get it on Spotify. But actually, to make a quality podcast, you want to make yourself accessible in a lot of places. And so one of the things that I've experienced doing, one of the things that me and my brother and my friend Wyatt, we do regularly, is actually we have something called a hosting site. So obviously there's YouTube. You got to upload separately. You have a YouTube channel. People are pretty familiar with that. But a hosting site allows you to take a audio export, so like a WAV or an MP3 file, you upload it to something that you upload it to the hosting site, and it actually distributes through an RSS feed your podcast every time you upload to all of these different places like Apple Podcast, like Stitcher, like Spotify, like Google Podcast, like even iHeartRadio. And there's a bunch of different hosting sites, but the one that I use is called Simplecast. It costs some money each month, but it's very worth it. It's about the same as a Netflix subscription. It's very worth it because it literally does all the work for you, and you are pretty much ensured that you're in good hands when it comes to distributing your content. So I recommend Simplecast, but there's a lot out there for you to choose from. So in order to make a quality podcast, think about how you are going to distribute your podcast. Don't just think of YouTube. Think of how you can make it accessible on all platforms where people are listening to podcasts so that people can find you. That's the most important thing. I mean, if you're making a podcast you want people to listen to, how are they going to find you? That's important. The other thing is music. So a lot of podcasts, I know when I first started, I was watching this one podcast by these group of people in California, and they had awesome graphics that paired super well with music. And it's those kind of things, as me who kind of does short films, I do a lot of video production, that's what's interesting me. Creating an experience, creating emotion, not just with pieces of, a short film, or not just with like a short documentary or a full documentary or a full film, but actually taking a podcast and trying to create emotion with it. Because when it comes down to it, it's just people talking. And so where are you getting your music from that's within bounds legally, but also is high quality? Well, there are a couple options. If you want to have access to a whole library of music, you can go to some place like Soundstripe or Epidemic Sound. I personally use Soundstripe. If you are just like, I want an intro song that also can work as an outro song for my podcast, I just want a one-off thing that's legal for me to use and I'm not going to be hit with any copyright strikes by YouTube, you can go to some place like premium beats, where you can actually buy royalty-free songs, just one song, and it's just a one-time thing, and without too much investment. You would be surprised sometimes that royalty-free music can get a little expensive, honestly. But when it comes down to it, and the more that's being created, and places like Soundstripe, if you're using it all the time, it's a wonderful investment that every content creator really should familiarize himself with and become comfortable with using and spending the money for it, because it's really a lifesaver when it comes down to it. So to make a quality podcast, think about where your music's coming from, because you want to welcome people into your show in a exciting or thoughtful way. It really depends on the podcast, and that actually parlays well to the final point here. The podcast motivation. I wrote this here because this actually helps me think about my own podcast, but it helps me explain it as well. Podcasts work best when paired, and what I mean by that is podcasts in themselves are really hard to market because you're doing a couple things. You're essentially trying to sell yourself as a personality that you're worth listening to and people being entertained by, or you're worth, someone receiving your wisdom, your knowledge, your teaching. And that can be pretty hard to do when you just do a podcast. You just start on YouTube and you're like, I want to be a content creator. Let's do a podcast because I think it's manageable. Well, believe it or not, sometimes podcasts are manageable. They really are. But the question is, once all of your friends on social media and your family have followed you, what else are you bringing to the table? Because podcasts rarely work when your only thing is podcasting. What is it within the world that you're bringing to the table to actually motivate the podcast? So, as an example, say you're a cook, say you're a chef, and then you want to do a podcast about cooking. You want to maybe interview or talk to, have cool conversations with other chefs around the world. You can do that, and actually people would get really excited about that because when they listen to your podcast, they actually want to try the food you're making, or someone you talk to, their food. They might want to go to their restaurant. But if you start a podcast and you say, I don't know, I like video games, that works. But if you're not like a gamer, if you're like not on Twitch or something, then people might not be so inclined to hear you talk about video games on a podcast. They might. There's a lot of podcasts out there. And so why I say it's good to be paired with is because you kind of have to, you really want to, as a good discipline for your life, be working on yourself, your craft, the things you do regularly so that you actually create good content, good information, good stories for your podcast. So podcasts work best when paired. One final example for that idea is for me personally. So I have aspirations and to be a filmmaker, to tell stories through the avenue of video production. And when I was younger, I thought, I need to make films, I need to make short films and get my name out there. And then I started getting into the YouTube game, and I was like, how do I do YouTube videos? Do I just try to make anything so that I can work towards being a filmmaker? Or do I just, YouTube's such the Wild West, people are hard to even nail down their niche, some of the most popular ones. And so over time, I was like, how do I create regular content? Because the world is so saturated with short films, with podcasts, with YouTube videos, with audio clips, with reels, with Instagram profiles. It's so saturated with all of this content that's trying to take your attention that for someone like me who wants to be a filmmaker, it's almost impossible for a short film that I make to blow up and go anywhere for me, especially not to make any money from it. And so you have to think in today's world, what are you doing to help your primary motivation? So for me, I wanted to do a podcast because, well, number one, I want to create a regular, consistent place for people to come and interact with me, and it also is just fun. And ultimately, the podcast for me is to motivate my filmmaking aspirations. There are other motivations that actually are personal when it comes to doing the podcast that I actually don't really speak to many people about. But that's the thing. Podcasts are there to be paired with something. They work best if you do that. Now, I'm not saying this is a complete rule, because there are plenty of examples of people who start a podcast, they get really popular, and that's all they do, just podcasting. But the majority of the time, people are going to show up to listen to your podcast or watch your podcast because they like other things you're doing. So in the world of like stand-up comedy, podcasts in the world of stand-up comedy are huge right now. I mean, they're huge. Joe Rogan kind of kicked that off because he's a stand-up comic. But if you really dig in, you find almost every stand-up comic out there has a podcast and also does another podcast with another stand-up comic. The reason why is because their main thing is they get up on stage and they do comedy. Some of them are even in movies. Some of them are actors. But their thing is making people laugh, entertaining them from the stage, and crafting jokes and telling stories. And so a podcast pairs perfectly with that because it feels like you can hang out with them. You get kind of on-the-fly jokes. You get to experience them as a person and not just for someone on stage. And so it works perfectly in that niche. But the thing is, podcasts work in every niche. And so to make a quality podcast, to really feel fulfilled in the work as a podcaster, you need to pair it with something. What's your primary motivation? Say you like woodcraft. That's actually something I am interested in. If you like woodcraft, then do a podcast about woodcraft. I think it's really important in today's world to kind of find a niche and work your podcast through that niche. It can be other things, but ultimately you're going to build a following. You're going to build a fan base that is loyal. Podcast fans are more loyal than almost any other platform or any other type of content because you become invested while listening to their ideas and their conversations and them being vulnerable and them making you laugh. So they're very loyal, but ultimately, how are you bringing them in? Because you can't cast a wide net in a world that is full of nets constantly. Everybody is out there trying to, get as many eyes on their content as possible. And you can't just go out with no strategy. And so I would highly recommend to make a quality podcast that you're going to see growth, you're going to see success, you're going to see interaction, and regular viewership in your content has to be paired with something that is about you personally. Could be a hobby, could be a job, could be a goal, could be a dream. But what is it? I want you to think about that. As I close, I just want to say, podcasts are a beautiful thing. They really are. I was having a conversation about this with someone recently that they were like, I don't understand podcasts. And they were a little bit older, not very old, but I don't understand why people will listen to other people that they don't know in person, or maybe they know them or just barely, talk for 20 minutes about nonsense. And then they start talking about a topic, but it's all over the place, and it lasts, an hour, 2 hours, hour and a half. They don't understand that. And I understand where that person was coming from, but I think ultimately podcasts and why they're so popular is they are informative, they are educational, they are fun, but really when it gets down to it, I think it's about the human experience. I think podcasts are a beautiful way to display the human experience to people all around the world who are interested in that. And it's not just about creating a piece of content for you to enjoy. It is, but that's not it. It's literally about inviting other people to share your thoughts, to have conversations, to get connected with people. Podcasts, something I've discovered over being involved with over 200 episodes of podcasts, both mine and other people's, is you don't realize it at first, but once people start watching and listening, you realize you are very interested in just talking and hearing and wanting to interact with the thoughts and the people who are watching you. And that's actually something that kind of surprises you at first, but it's a really beautiful thing. I think podcasts ultimately are about the human experience. And if we can come at it with that mentality, then we're creating something beautiful. We're truly creating a quality podcast. So think about that. Thank you for watching all the way to this point. If you are still listening and you're still watching, really glad you are. As I've said multiple times, I have a podcast with a couple other really cool dudes. It's on this channel. I ask you to subscribe, and also go and check out the full episodes we come out with regularly, multiple times a week. We're on everything I mentioned earlier: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. We're out here. So, yeah, check us out. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can watch us, or you can go and listen to us, whatever you prefer. But we're trying to make quality podcasts. Leave in the comments if you have any questions for me, specifically me, about creating a quality podcast. I would love to help if I can. If I can't, I will let you know. But I would love to help if I can. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you found, value out of this video. Thanks.